The caseworker from Adult Protective Services knocked on my door at 9:10 on a Wednesday morning, and I want you to know I wasn't surprised, because I'd already known for 6 days that my own son was the one who'd called her. If I hadn't sat down with Pastor Ellis Grant and a stewardship counselor named Louise Frayne 21 years earlier, on a folding chair in the fellowship hall of New Hope Baptist Church, that Wednesday morning would have ended very differently. And I suspect I wouldn't be sitting in this same house telling you about it today. My name is Thomas Ledbetter. Everybody in Milledgeville, Georgia, calls me Tom or Deacon Tom on Sundays, a title I've carried at New Hope for going on 30 years now. I'm 75, spent 34 years walking a mail route before my knees finally told me it was time to sit down for a living. And I've been a widower for 8 years since my wife Carolyn passed. Cancer, the same patient, cruel kind that takes its time. I want to tell you something about tithing before I tell you what my son tried to do to me, because I don't think you can understand the rest of this without it. I started giving 10% of every paycheck to New Hope the year I turned 23. Back when 10% of a postal carrier's paycheck meant real sacrifice, meant Carolyn and I eating beans more often than either of us would have liked. I never once thought of it as money leaving my life. I thought of it, and still think of it, as the Lord's portion simply passing through my hands on its way, somewhere it was always meant to go. That's not a sentiment I expect everyone listening to share. And I don't need you to. I only need you to understand that it was never negotiable in my mind. Not once in 52 years, which matters considerably for what comes next. Here's a question worth sitting with, because I've sat with a version of it myself more than once. Have you ever made a decision rooted in something you believed deeply, something the people closest to you thought was foolish or old-fashioned, and then watched that very decision become the thing that saved you from them? My son Ray is 51 now, runs an auto repair shop over on Highway 22 that struggled through 3 lean years running. First the pandemic, then a bad partnership that cost him 2 bays worth of equipment in a lawsuit settlement, then simply the ordinary difficulty of small business in a town that's slowly losing its young people to Atlanta. Ray's not a wicked man. I want that understood clearly. He's a frightened man who's spent a long while now watching his life's work slip sideways. And fear does things to people, even good people. Even people you raised in a church pew every Sunday of their childhood. Ray had started asking, gently at first about 18 months ago, whether I'd consider a reverse mortgage on the house, or perhaps redirecting what he called my church money toward keeping the shop afloat until business picked back up. I told him, the first several times he asked, simply that my finances were arranged the way they were arranged, and that I couldn't do what he was asking. He took that at first, the way a son takes a father's stubbornness, with frustration but not suspicion. What Ray didn't know, because I'd never fully explained it to him, not out of secrecy exactly, but because the subject never seemed to fit comfortably into a Sunday dinner conversation, was the specific shape of an arrangement I'd made 2 decades earlier, back when Carolyn and I sold a small piece of inherited farmland from her family and found ourselves, for the first time in our modest lives, holding more money at once than we knew quite what to do with. I want to walk you through what Louise Frayne explained to us that afternoon in the fellowship hall, because I think it's worth understanding plainly, and because almost nobody explains it to folks until they stumble into a stewardship counselor by accident the way Carolyn and I did. A charitable gift annuity works something like this. You give a lump sum to a qualified charitable organization, in our case, through the Georgia Baptist Foundation on behalf of New Hope, and in exchange, that organization contractually guarantees you fixed payments for the rest of your life, the same way a commercial annuity would, except the charity also receives a partial income tax deduction credited to you the year you make the gift, and whatever principal remains when you pass eventually goes to the church itself. Carolyn and I gave $40,000 that year, money we genuinely didn't need for daily living, and in return, New Hope's foundation has paid us faithfully on the 15th of every single month for the last 21 years. A fixed amount that never changes regardless of what the stock market does, regardless of interest rates, regardless of anything at all. Except whether I'm still breathing, Carolyn asked Louise that afternoon, the one question I remember most clearly all these years later. What happens to the money if we both live another 30 years and the payments end up costing the foundation more than we ever gave them? Louise smiled at that, the particular patient smile of someone who's answered the question many times before, and said that was precisely the risk the foundation accepted in exchange for the gift. The same way an insurance company accepts risk on any annuity, and that the arrangement was regulated carefully enough in Georgia that the foundation couldn't simply walk away from its promise no matter how long we lived to collect on it. Carolyn liked that answer considerably. She always did prefer arrangements where somebody besides us had skin in the game, as she used to put it, and I think some part of her peace about that decision, right up until she passed, came from knowing the payments would keep arriving for me even after she no longer needed them herself. I want to ask you something honestly, the way I've asked myself more than once since all this happened. If you'd sat in that fellowship hall 21 years ago and heard an arrangement like that explained to you, faith and finance woven together in one contract, would you have trusted it the way Carolyn and I chose to? Or would it have sounded the way it apparently sounded to my own son decades later? Like something a vulnerable old man had been talked into by a persuasive pastor, because that, it turned out, was exactly the story Ray had constructed in his own mind. About 2 months before that Wednesday morning knock, Ray came by the house on a Sunday afternoon, sat across from me at the same kitchen table Carolyn and I bought the year Ray was born, and told me plainly that he'd been doing some research and that what he'd learned troubled him considerably. He said church gift annuities were exactly the kind of arrangement predatory pastors used to drain elderly congregants of their savings. He said Pastor Ellis had been awfully attentive to me since Carolyn passed, awfully willing to sit and pray with me, awfully present at a time when I was, in Ray's words, at my most vulnerable and least clear-headed. He said he loved me too much to watch it happen without saying something. I told him as calmly as I could manage that the arrangement predated Pastor Ellis's time at New Hope entirely, that Carolyn had been very much alive and clear-headed when we signed it, that I received an official statement from the Georgia Baptist Foundation every single January, listing every payment made, and that I'd be glad to show him every piece of that paperwork whenever he wanted to see it. Ray didn't ask to see the paperwork. Ray, I later learned, had already called Adult Protective Services 3 days before that Sunday conversation, reporting what he described as suspected financial exploitation of a vulnerable senior by clergy, a phrase I'm certain he found somewhere in his research, one that carries considerable legal weight once it's spoken into a government caseworker's phone line. My granddaughter Bethany, Ray's youngest, 16 that year, was at the house the following weekend helping me weed Carolyn's old flower bed along the side fence. And at one point, without any prompting from me at all, she said something I've turned over many times since. "Grandpa, Dad's been really stressed about the shop lately. Way worse than he lets on. He keeps saying if the bank doesn't work with him on the loan, he doesn't know what he's going to do." I asked her gently whether her father had mentioned me in connection with any of that worry. She said, with the particular honesty only a 16-year-old manages before she's learned to filter it, that he'd said something about how if I'd just be reasonable about the church money, none of this would be a problem in the first place. I want you to notice what that told me, sitting there in Carolyn's flower bed with dirt under my fingernails. My son wasn't primarily worried about my vulnerability to a predatory pastor. My son was worried about a bank loan and had constructed, whether he fully admitted it to himself or not, a narrative that made redirecting my finances toward his shop look like protecting his father, rather than what it actually was. The caseworker, a patient, thorough woman named Miss Odom, sat with me at that same kitchen table for the better part of 2 hours that Wednesday morning. I want to say plainly that she did her job exactly as she should have, asking careful questions about my memory, my daily routines, whether anyone controlled access to my bank accounts, whether I felt pressured by anyone regarding my finances or my faith. I answered every question honestly, and then I did something I suspect surprised her. I asked whether she'd like to see 21 years of documentation. I keep every statement the Georgia Baptist Foundation has ever sent me in a filing cabinet in what used to be Carolyn's sewing room, organized by year, the way 34 years of sorting mail for a living teaches a man to organize almost everything else in his life. I laid them out for Miss Odom in order. The original gift annuity contract from 21 years earlier bearing both Carolyn's signature and mine. The annual tax statement showing the charitable deduction we'd claimed the year we made the gift, and 21 years of monthly payment records showing the exact same fixed amount arriving like clockwork. Whether the market was up or down, whether Pastor Ellis had been at New Hope 1 year or 15. I also showed her something else. A folder Pastor Ellis had insisted on keeping himself, separate from the church's general financial records, documenting every single pastoral visit he'd made to me since Carolyn passed, dated and brief, along with a note he'd written years earlier before any of this happened, explaining that he kept such records specifically because he'd watched, at a previous church, an elderly congregant's family falsely accuse a well-meaning minister of exactly this kind of exploitation, and he'd resolved never to be caught without clean documentation if it ever happened to him. Miss Odom reviewed all of it carefully, asked a few more questions, and told me, with what I understood to be genuine relief in her voice, that she saw no evidence whatsoever of financial exploitation, that the arrangement predated any relationship with the current pastor by well over a decade, and that she'd be closing the case as unfounded. I want to be honest about what happened after that because I think the honest version matters more than a tidier one would. Ray came by 2 days later, and I could see, the moment he stepped through the door, that Miss Odom had already informed him the report had gone nowhere. He didn't apologize right away. He sat at that kitchen table and said, in a voice that wanted to sound defensive but came out mostly hollow, that he'd only been trying to protect me. I told him as gently as I knew how, that filing a false report of elder financial abuse against a man of God who visits the sick and prays with widows is a serious thing to do to protect someone, and that if he'd simply asked to see the paperwork instead of a caseworker, we could have had this entire conversation over coffee, rather than through a government investigation. I also told him something I'd learned only the week before from my own attorney, a friend from church who'd looked into it on my behalf, out of concern rather than any request from me, that knowingly filing a false report with Adult Protective Services can itself carry legal consequences in Georgia, fines, and in some cases worse. And that Ms. Odom's office had noted, in closing the file, that the report appeared to have been made in connection with an unrelated financial dispute rather than genuine welfare concern, language that could matter a great deal if he ever tried something like it again. Ray went very quiet at that. I watched something in him deflate, not the deflation of a man realizing he'd been wrong exactly, but the deflation of a man realizing the door he'd been counting on had just closed for good, and that he'd damaged something considerably more valuable than a bank loan in the process of trying to force it open. I won't pretend the months since have restored everything between us. Ray and I speak carefully, mostly about Bethany and his older boy, rarely straying near the shop or the church, or that Wednesday morning. He did eventually work out revised terms with his bank on his own, terms that required him to actually document his business's finances properly for the first time in years, a process his own accountant told him should have happened long before any of this started. I think, though I can't know this fully, that some part of him understood, watching me lay out 21 years of careful records at that kitchen table, exactly the kind of discipline he'd never quite built into his own business. And I suspect that recognition stung considerably more than any conversation about tithing ever could have. Pastor Ellis still visits most Thursday afternoons, same as before. And we don't speak much about the investigation either. Though he did tell me once, sitting on my back porch with sweet tea going warm between us, that he'd kept that separate folder of visitation records for 11 years by the time Ray's report came through, hoping the whole while he'd never need it, and grateful, in a complicated way that faith sometimes asks of a man, that the foresight had mattered when it finally did. I still give my 10% every single month, same as I have for 52 years now, and I still receive that same fixed payment from the Georgia Baptist Foundation on the 15th, a little smaller in real terms than it was 21 years ago, thanks to inflation, though large enough still to cover what I need without ever touching principal. I'd rather leave exactly where Carolyn and I always intended it to go. If there's a single thing I'd want anyone listening to carry away from this, it's not really about church giving specifically, though I'd encourage anyone with a genuine charitable inclination to at least understand what a gift annuity actually offers, before dismissing it as foolishness the way my own son nearly convinced himself it was. It's simply this: keep your paperwork. Whatever quiet, unglamorous financial decision you make in good conscience, years before anyone questions it, document it plainly enough that the truth can defend itself without you having to raise your voice, because you never know which Wednesday morning it might need to. If you've ever had someone you love mistake your faith, or your discipline, or your quiet decisions for foolishness, only to be proven wrong later by nothing more dramatic than a filing cabinet full of honest paperwork, I'd like to know. And if you were sitting across that kitchen table from Miss Odom yourself, 21 years of your own decisions laid out plainly in front of you, what would those records actually show?